A howl tore through the dark forest, sharp and full of pain, and Grace froze between the trees with her basket of herbs still in her hand. She had walked this path 100 times before, gathering roots for her mother's small clinic, but she had never heard a sound like this. It was not the cry of an ordinary animal. It was deeper, heavier, almost human in its suffering. Her feet moved before her mind could tell her it was dangerous. She pushed through a wall of thorns and stopped cold. Lying across a bed of crushed ferns was the largest wolf she had ever seen, its silver fur soaked dark and its breathing shallow and uneven. One side of its body was torn open, and a pool was spreading beneath it, staining the moss black in the moonlight. Grace's heart pounded, but she did not run. She had spent her whole life around wounded things, birds with broken wings, dogs left behind by careless owners, and something in her refused to leave any creature to die alone. She knelt beside the wolf slowly, keeping her voice low and steady. It could snap her arm off with one bite if it wanted to, but its eyes, when they opened, held no threat at all. They held something closer to pleading. Grace set her basket down and reached for the herbs she always carried, crushed leaves that could slow bleeding, a paste her mother had taught her to make from bark and honey. She walked quickly, her fingers steady despite the shaking in her chest, pressing the paste into the wound and trying to hold the edges together. It was not enough. The wound was too deep, the flow too strong, and within minutes her hands were slick and her supplies were gone. She looked around in desperation, searching for anything, a scrap of cloth, a strip of leather, anything that could serve as a binding, but there was nothing. The wolf's breathing grew fainter, and panic rose in her throat. Then her eyes fell on her own hair, long and thick, falling well past her waist, hair she had never cut in her entire life, hair her grandmother used to braid by candlelight and call her greatest pride. There was no time to think about pride. Grace pulled a small knife from her belt, the one she used to cut roots and stems, and without hesitation she sawed through the length of her hair as close to her scalp as she dared. She wound the thick strands around the wound, again and again, pulling them tight, using every last inch to bind the gash closed. Her hands moved on instinct, her mind blank to everything except the fading pulse beneath her fingers. She pressed her palms against the makeshift bandage and held firm, whispering words of comfort she was not even sure the wolf could understand. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The wolf's chest rose and fell, and slowly, painfully slowly, the rhythm began to steady. The bleeding, at last, began to slow. Grace did not move from her spot, afraid that if she let go even for a moment, everything she had done would come undone. She sat there through the cooling night air, shivering in her thin shawl, her shorn hair falling loose around her shoulders in uneven layers, watching over a creature she knew nothing about. She did not know that deep within the wolf's chest, a silent pulse had gone out the moment its heart steadied, a pulse that traveled far beyond the forest, through bonds unseen by human eyes, straight into the mind of a man sitting alone in a stone chamber many miles away. She did not know that the wolf lying before her was no ordinary animal at all, but the soul-bound companion of the most powerful ruler in the land. She only knew that something alive needed her, and she had given what she had to keep it that way. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the treetops, the wolf's eyes had opened fully, clear and alert, fixed on her with an intelligence that made her breath catch. It was looking at her the way a person looks at someone who has just saved their life. Grace managed a tired smile, brushing a loose strand of her now short hair from her face. "You're going to be fine," she whispered, though she had no way of truly knowing that. "I don't know what you are, but you fought hard tonight." The wolf let out a low sound, almost like a sigh, and rested its great head gently against her knee, as if it understood every word. For a moment, the forest around them seemed impossibly still, holding its breath along with them, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a waking bird. Grace had no idea that her quiet act of kindness, done with nothing but instinct and a knife meant for cutting roots, was about to change the entire course of her life. She did not know that far away, a king had just felt his own strength return to him in a rush, and that he was already calling for his fastest riders, demanding to know where his wolf had fallen, and who, if anyone, had been there when it happened. All she knew, in that quiet, golden moment of dawn, was that the wolf was breathing steadily, its eyes calm, and that whatever she had just started could not be undone. She stayed with it until the sun climbed higher, gently stroking its fur, letting it rest against her while she hummed an old tune her mother used to sing. She had no plan beyond staying until she was sure it would leave. She never once considered that soldiers dressed in black and silver were already racing through the trees toward that very clearing, following a trail only they could sense, moving faster than any ordinary horse could carry them. She never considered that the wolf beside her was more than a companion to its master, that its life and his were bound together in a way few outside the royal bloodline understood, and that by saving one, she had unknowingly saved the other. The forest around her had never felt so alive, every leaf and shadow suddenly charged with meaning she could not yet grasp. Somewhere beyond the tree line, hoofs pounded against packed earth, drawing closer with every passing second, carrying with them a man whose entire kingdom depended on the very creature now resting its head so peacefully against a stranger's knee. Hoofs thundered through the clearing before Grace even had time to stand up. She scrambled to her feet, pulling the wolf's massive head gently from her lap, her heart hammering as a group of riders in black and silver armor burst through the trees. At the front of them rode a man who looked nothing like the soldiers around him, taller, broader, with a presence that seemed to press down on the air itself. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and the moment they landed on the wolf lying in the ferns, something in his expression cracked open. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, crossing the clearing in long, urgent strides. Grace stepped back instinctively, unsure whether to run or stay, but the wolf lifted its head at the sight of him and let out a low, welcoming whimper. The man dropped to his knees beside the creature, running his hands over its fur with a tenderness that seemed strange coming from someone who looked so hardened. He examined the wound, wrapped tightly with strands of dark hair, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Grace shifted nervously, clutching the edge of her torn shawl. "Is he your wolf?" she asked quietly, unsure of the right words. "I found him hurt in the ferns. I did what I could." The man looked up at her then, and it was as if he was truly seeing her for the first time, noticing the uneven, freshly cut hair falling just above her shoulders, the dried blood on her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes after a night spent awake. His gaze moved to the binding around the wound, and understanding dawned slowly across his face. He reached out and touched the strands wrapped around the wolf's side, feeling the texture, recognizing instantly what they were. "You cut your own hair," he said, his voice quiet with disbelief. "To save him." "It was all I had," Grace answered simply. "He was dying. I couldn't just watch." The soldiers behind him exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves, but the man silenced them with a single raised hand. He rose to his feet slowly, still staring at her as though trying to solve a puzzle he had never expected to encounter. In his kingdom, hair held meaning beyond simple vanity. It was tied to identity, to pride, to the unspoken pact between a person and their own sense of self. For a woman to cut hers away, especially for a stranger's wounded animal, was not something done lightly, and it was certainly not something he had ever witnessed. "Bran has been with me since before I took the throne," he said finally, gesturing toward the wolf, who was now watching the exchange with calm, intelligent eyes. "He is not just an animal to me. What you did tonight, most people in my kingdom would not have done for their own kin." Grace did not fully understand what he meant by kin or throne, and exhaustion was making it difficult to think clearly. She simply nodded, unsure of what response was expected of her. The man studied her a moment longer, taking in her simple clothes, her calloused hands, the herbs scattered across the ferns where she had walked through the night. Whatever he was thinking, he did not share it immediately. Instead, he turned to his soldiers and issued a series of quick commands, ordering a stretcher to be brought for the wolf and a horse prepared for Grace. "Wait," she said, suddenly alarmed. "I only wanted to help. I don't need to go anywhere. My mother will be worried." The man's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "You saved the life of someone very important to me," he said. "I cannot simply let you walk back into the forest as though nothing happened. Word will be sent to your mother? You have my word that she will not worry for long." Grace wanted to argue, but something about the steadiness in his voice, and the gentle way the wolf now leaned against her leg as if refusing to be separated from her, made her hesitate. She looked down at the great creature, its eyes half closed in comfort, and felt an unexpected pull of attachment already forming, one night old but somehow deep. Reluctantly, she allowed herself to be led toward the horses, casting one last glance back at the clearing where everything had changed so suddenly. The ride to the palace took most of the morning, the forest thinning into open fields, then rising hills dotted with small villages, until finally a massive structure of pale stone came into view, its towers catching the late morning sun. Grace had heard stories of the palace as a child, tales exchanged around fires about the Alpha King who rode the wolf packs of the region with an iron will and a temper few dared to challenge. She had never imagined she would see it up close, let alone be riding toward it after a night spent saving its master's closest companion. As they passed through the outer gates, guards and servants alike turned to stare at the unusual procession, whispers rippling through the courtyard at the sight of the wounded wolf being carried on a stretcher, and the young woman riding beside the king with her hair cut roughly short. Grace felt the weight of every gaze, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look among the polished stone and fine clothing surrounding her. She kept her chin lifted anyway, refusing to let her nerves show. The wolf was taken immediately to a private chamber where healers waited, though the king insisted on remaining close, watching over the treatment with an intensity that left no doubt about the bond between them. Grace was shown to a smaller room nearby, offered water and food, and told to rest, though sleep felt impossible with her mind racing over everything that had happened since the previous night. It was hours later, as the sun began to dip low outside her window, that a soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find the king standing there, alone this time, without his soldiers or the former air he had carried in the forest. He looked tired but relieved, and there was something almost hesitant in the way he stood, as if unsure how to begin. "Bran is stable," he said. "The healers say he will recover fully, though it will take time. They also said that without the binding you created, he likely would not have survived long enough for us to reach him." Grace felt a small measure of relief loosen the tightness in her chest. "I'm glad," she said honestly. "He fought hard to stay alive." The king studied her for a long moment, his grey eyes searching hers as though trying to understand something that logic alone could not explain. "What is your name?" he asked finally, realizing he had never asked. "Grace," she answered. "I am Ryan," he said, though something in his tone suggested that this simple introduction carried far more weight than the words themselves implied. Ryan, ruler of these lands, bonded to the very wolf whose life now rested partly in her hands. "Thank you, Grace, for what you did. I don't know many who would have made the same choice." Grace shifted under his gaze, unused to such direct gratitude from someone who so clearly held immense power. "It wasn't a choice, really," she said quietly. "He was suffering. I couldn't have lived with myself if I had just walked away." Something shifted in Ryan's expression at those words, a flicker of surprise mixed with something softer, something he seemed to quickly mask beneath his usual composed exterior. He nodded once, thanked her again, and turned to leave, though he paused at the doorway as if there was more he wanted to say. In the end, he simply told her that she was welcome to stay as long as she wished, that the palace would provide for her needs, and that Bran, he suspected, would want her nearby during his recovery. As the door closed behind him, Grace sat back on the edge of the bed, running her fingers through what remained of her hair, still adjusting to its unfamiliar shortness. She thought of her mother back in the village, likely worried sick by now, and hoped word had truly been sent as promised. She thought of the wolf, resting somewhere down the hall, alive because of a decision made in a moment of pure instinct. And she thought of the king, Ryan, whose eyes had held something unreadable when he looked at her, something that made her stomach twist in a way she did not fully understand. Outside her window, the sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and somewhere within the palace walls, a wolf slept peacefully for the first time in days, while its master sat alone in his chamber, turning over thoughts he had never expected to have about a quiet village woman with short hair and steady hands. Word had indeed been sent to Grace's mother, though it took 3 full days before a reply arrived, carried by a palace messenger who reported that the older woman had wept with relief and worry in equal measure, and had asked, quite firmly, when her daughter would be allowed to return home. Grace read the short letter twice, feeling a pang of guilt settle in her chest as she realized how much time had already passed. Yet each time she thought of leaving, something held her back, and she told herself it was only because Bran was still healing, still needed watching, still called up most afternoons with his great head resting near wherever she happened to be sitting. The palace was unlike anything Grace had known. Long stone corridors led to gardens filled with flowers she had never seen in the wild, and servants moved with quiet efficiency through halls lined with tapestries depicting wolves in every pose imaginable, running, howling, standing guard over sleeping villages. She was given proper clothing, soft fabrics dyed in deep colors, though she still felt like an outsider every time she caught her reflection, her hair uneven and short against gowns clearly meant for someone with a full head of elegant curls. The whispers followed her everywhere. She caught fragments of conversation as she passed groups of nobles in the hallways, comments about the strange village girl who had cut off her own hair, questions about why the king seemed to visit her chambers more often than protocol required, speculation about what exactly she had done to earn such attention. Grace tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the quiet hours she spent with Bran, reading softly to him from books she found in the palace library, watching the color slowly return to his fur, the strength return to his steps. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, sunlight streaming through tall windows onto the stone floor where Bran lay resting, that Ryan found her again, slipping into the room without the usual formality of guards or announcements. He settled into a chair across from her, watching as she gently checked the wound beneath the bandages the healers had properly applied days earlier. "He grows stronger every day," Ryan observed, his voice carrying a note of quiet gratitude that had become familiar to her over the past week. "He's a fighter," Grace replied, smoothing her hand along Bran's flank as the wolf let out a contented sigh. "I've never seen an animal recover this quickly from such a serious injury." "He's not simply an animal," Ryan said carefully, choosing his words as though testing how much to reveal. "Bran is bonded to me, has been since I was very young. Our lives are tied together in ways that go beyond ordinary companionship. When he suffers, I feel it. When he grows weak, so do I. Had he died in that clearing, I would have lost far more than a loyal wolf." Grace absorbed this information slowly, understanding now why the soldiers had reacted with such urgency, why Ryan himself had ridden out personally rather than sending others in his place. "You would have lost part of yourself," she said quietly, piecing together the truth. "Yes," Ryan admitted. "And instead, because of a stranger's quick thinking and considerable sacrifice, I remain whole." He gestured toward her hair, still shorter than she was accustomed to, though it had begun growing back in soft waves that framed her face differently than before. "I have not forgotten what that sacrifice looked like. Hair holds meaning in ways that go deeper than fashion among our people. To cut it away for someone you had never met before speaks to a kind of character I rarely encounter, especially not within these walls." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks at the compliment, unused to such direct and thoughtful attention. "It grows back," she said simply, trying to deflect the weight of his words. "His life would not have." Ryan studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes. "You speak as though your own worth means little to you," he observed. "As though giving pieces of yourself away is simply what you do without a second thought." The observation struck closer to truth than Grace expected, and she found herself unable to answer immediately. She had spent her entire life caring for others, following her mother through the village to tend the sick, giving away food when neighbors had none, placing everyone else's needs above whatever she might have wanted for herself. It had never occurred to her to think of these choices as anything other than simply the right thing to do. "I suppose I've never really thought about it that way," she admitted quietly. "Perhaps you should start," Ryan said, his tone gentle rather than critical. "Not everyone deserves the kind of sacrifice you're so quick to offer. Though in this case," he added, glancing toward Bran, who had fallen asleep between them, "I find myself endlessly grateful that you did." Their conversation shifted after that, moving into easier territory, stories from Grace's village, tales of her mother's remedies and the small triumphs and struggles of caring for people with little means and endless needs. Ryan listened with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed a curiosity about ordinary life that surprised her, given his position and power. In turn, he shared pieces of his own world, the responsibilities of ruling packs scattered across vast territories, the constant threat of rival factions testing borders, the loneliness that came with a role few could truly understand from the outside. Days turned into weeks, and Grace found her planned departure delayed again and again, first by Bran's continued recovery, then by genuine enjoyment of conversations with Ryan that stretched longer than either of them seemed to intend. She began to notice small things, the way his expression relaxed only in her presence, the way his advisors seemed both curious and cautious about the growing familiarity between their king and the village healer's daughter. Not everyone in the palace welcomed this development. Lady Vera, a noblewoman with ambitions of her own regarding the king's attention, made her displeasure known through carefully placed comments and cold glances whenever Grace passed through common areas. She questioned openly, though never directly to Grace's face, why a common village girl with hastily cut hair deserved such consideration from a ruler who could have his pick of noble daughters from every allied territory. Grace tried to remain unaffected by the whispers and cold shoulders, focusing instead on Bran's recovery and the strange, unexpected friendship growing between herself and Ryan. Yet she could not entirely ignore the reality of her situation, a village girl with no title, no land, no claim to anything beyond her own 2 hands and the kindness she offered freely to anyone who needed it. The gap between her word and Ryan's felt, at times, impossibly wide. One evening, as autumn winds began sweeping through the palace gardens, Ryan found her sitting alone near a fountain, watching the water catch the last light of sunset. He approached quietly, settling beside her without asking permission, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the preceding weeks. "Your mother has written again," he said, producing a folded letter from within his coat. "She misses you greatly, though she says the village has managed well enough in your absence, thanks to the supplies I arranged to be sent in your place." Grace took the letter gratefully, scanning her mother's familiar handwriting, feeling a fresh wave of homesickness mixed with something else entirely, a reluctance to leave that surprised her with its intensity. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly, referring to the supplies. "I wanted to," Ryan replied simply. "It seemed the least I could do, considering how much you've given without asking for anything in return." Grace folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her sleeve, and turned to look at him properly, studying the strong lines of his face illuminated by the fading light. "I should go home soon," she admitted, though the words felt heavier than she expected them to. "My mother needs help with the clinic, and Bran is nearly fully healed now. There's no real reason for me to stay much longer." Something flickered across Ryan's expression, quickly masked but not quickly enough for Grace to miss entirely. "Perhaps not by necessity," he said carefully, his voice quieter than before. "Though I find myself hoping you might consider staying regardless of necessity." Before Grace could formulate a response to that unexpected admission, a commotion erupted near the palace gates, shouts rising into the evening air, guards rushing past with expressions of alarm. Ryan was on his feet instantly, his relaxed demeanor vanishing into the hardened focus of a ruler facing potential danger. Grace watched him go, her heart pounding with a mixture of concern and confusion over words left unfinished, unaware that the peace they had built over the past weeks was about to be tested in ways neither of them could have anticipated. The commotion turned out to be a messenger arriving from the northern border, exhausted and half-frozen, carrying grim news that spread through the palace within the hour. The rival pack responsible for Bran's near-fatal injury had not simply retreated after their failed attempt. Instead, they had regrouped, gathering allies from smaller factions eager to challenge Ryan's authority, and were now believed to be planning something far more dangerous than another attack on the wolf alone. Grace learned the details slowly, pieced together from overheard conversations among worried servants and the tense expressions on the faces of advisors summoned to emergency meetings that stretched late into the night. The rival pack, led by a man named Victor whose ambitions for territory had long simmered beneath a veneer of forced alliance, had apparently discovered that Bran's survival was due to the intervention of a village outsider, and that this outsider now held an unusual place within the palace and within the king's personal regard. If they could not defeat Ryan by attacking Bran directly, Victor and his allies seemed to have concluded that striking at something else Ryan valued might prove equally effective, perhaps even more so, given the emotional weight such an attack would carry. Grace felt a cold weight settle in her stomach when she finally understood the implications, the realization that she herself had become a target simply by existing within Ryan's orbit. Ryan called her to his private study late that evening, his face drawn with exhaustion and barely restrained anger. Advisors flanked him on either side, their expressions grave as they laid out maps and reports detailing troop movements along the northern border. Grace stood quietly near the doorway, absorbing the tension in the room, until Ryan finally looked up and gestured her closer. "I need you to understand the danger you're now facing," he said without preamble, his tone stripped of the softness she had grown accustomed to over recent weeks. "Victor's forces have made it clear they intend to use you as leverage against me, either through capture or through more direct means. I cannot allow that to happen. Grace absorbed this information with a steadiness that surprised even herself, years of handling difficult situations in the village having taught her to remain calm even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. What do you need me to do? She asked simply. Stay close to the palace, Ryan instructed. Avoid the outer gardens and any areas near the eastern wall until we've resolved this threat. I'm doubling the guards assigned to your quarters, and Bran will remain with you whenever possible, given his fully recovered strength and his own considerable investment in your safety. The following days passed in a tense blur, the palace humming with quiet anxiety despite outward appearances of normalcy. Grace found herself grateful for Bran's constant presence, the great wolf rarely leaving her side, his senses far sharper than any human guards, alert to sounds and movements she could not detect herself. Ryan, meanwhile, threw himself into strategic planning, meeting with advisors for hours at a stretch, his face growing more haggard with each passing day as reports continued arriving detailing Victor's steadily advancing forces. Grace tried to make herself useful during this period of waiting, offering her healing knowledge to the palace physicians, who initially regarded her village remedies with skepticism but gradually came to respect her practical understanding of herbs and treatments unfamiliar to their more formal training. It gave her purpose during the anxious days, something to focus on besides the growing dread of what might happen if Victor's forces breached the palace defenses. It was on a grey afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the initial warning arrived, that the threat finally materialized in a way none of them had fully anticipated. Grace had ventured into the palace gardens despite the standing instructions to remain closer to the main building, drawn by a rare moment of sunshine breaking through the persistent autumn clouds, wanting nothing more than a few minutes of fresh air away from the tension permeating every hallway. She should have known better. The attack came swiftly and without warning, figures emerging from behind hedges and garden walls that should have been secured, moving with the coordinated precision of trained fighters rather than random opportunists. Grace's instinct screamed at her to run, and she did, sprinting toward the main building even as her mind struggled to process what was happening, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Bran, who had been resting nearby, was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Grace and the approaching threat with a fierce growl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. He moved with a speed that belied his recent recovery, meeting the first attacker with a ferocity that sent the man stumbling backward, clearly unprepared for the strength of a wolf they had assumed would still be weakened from his earlier injuries. Grace continued running, calling out for help as loudly as her lungs allowed, praying that someone within the palace would hear her before the situation grew worse. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of the confrontation continuing, Bran holding his ground against multiple opponents, buying her precious seconds to reach safety. Her foot caught on a raised stone in the garden path, sending her sprawling forward, pain shooting through her palms as she caught herself against the ground. Before she could fully rise, rough hands seized her arms, hauling her upward with brutal efficiency. Grace struggled against the grip, kicking and twisting with every ounce of strength she possessed, refusing to simply submit to whatever these strangers intended for her. Her cries grew louder, desperate now, as she saw more figures emerging from the garden shadows, clearly intent on using the chaos to complete whatever mission had brought them here. Just as her strength began to falter against the overwhelming force holding her, the sound of pounding footsteps and shouted commands filled the air, palace guards finally responding to the commotion, weapons drawn as they poured into the garden from multiple directions. At the front of this response came Ryan himself, his expression transformed into something Grace had never witnessed before, a cold and terrifying fury that seemed to radiate from every line of his body. He moved through the chaos with little efficiency, guards falling into formation around him as he closed the distance toward where Grace struggled against her captors. The attackers, realizing the tide had turned decisively against them, began attempting retreat, but Ryan's forces moved too quickly, cutting off escape routes with practiced coordination that spoke to years of training and experience defending against exactly this kind of threat. Within minutes, the garden had been secured, the attackers either captured or driven off entirely, and Grace found herself finally released from the grip that had held her, stumbling forward into arms that caught her before she could fall. She looked up to find Ryan holding her steady, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that seemed to catalog every scratch, every sign of distress, as though physically confirming she remained unharmed. Bran limped toward them moments later, favoring one leg but otherwise seemingly uninjured beyond minor scrapes, having successfully driven off the attackers who had first confronted him before palace reinforcements arrived. Grace reached out instinctively to check his condition, relief flooding through her at finding no serious wounds despite the fierce fight he had clearly endured on her behalf. "You could have been killed," Ryan said, his voice rough with an emotion he seemed to be struggling to contain. "Both of you." "I'm all right," Grace assured him, though her hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "Bran protected me. If he hadn't intervened when he did, I don't know what would have happened." Ryan's jaw tightened, his gaze moving between Grace and his lawyer Wolf with an expression that mixed gratitude with something far more complicated. He guided her gently toward the palace, his arm remaining protectively around her shoulders even as guards began the process of securing prisoners and assessing the full scope of what had just occurred. Once inside, safely away from any lingering threat, Ryan turned to face her fully, his composed exterior finally cracking under the weight of everything he had nearly lost. "I have spent weeks telling myself that my concern for your safety was simply gratitude," he admitted, his voice quieter now, stripped of the authority he usually carried so effortlessly. "Watching you struggle against those men just now, I realized I can no longer pretend that's the whole truth. The thought of losing you today terrified me in ways I have not felt in a very long time, not since the early days when Bran and I first bonded and I understood exactly how much could be lost in a single moment." Grace stood frozen, absorbing words she had perhaps hoped for without fully allowing herself to acknowledge the hope. "What are you saying?" she asked softly, needing to hear it stated plainly rather than left to interpretation. "I'm saying that somewhere during these past weeks, you have become someone I cannot imagine my life without," Ryan said, his grey eyes holding her steadily despite the vulnerability evident in his admission. "Not simply as the woman who saved Bran's life, though I remain endlessly grateful for that, but as someone whose presence has changed the way I see my own existence, my own responsibilities, my own future." The weight of his words settled over Grace slowly, warmth spreading through her chest despite the lingering fear from the attack still coursing through her system. She had not allowed herself to fully examine her own growing feelings over recent weeks, telling herself that her continued presence in the palace was simply about Bran's recovery, about practical concerns rather than anything deeper. Yet standing here now, having nearly lost everything in a chaotic instant, she found she could no longer deny the truth of her own heart either. "I think," she said slowly, choosing her words with care, "that somewhere during these weeks, I stopped thinking of living as something I actually wanted to do." Ryan's expression shifted at her admission, relief and something warmer breaking through the tension that had gripped his features since the attack began. Before either of them could say more, however, an advisor approached with urgent news requiring immediate attention, the captured attackers apparently willing to share information about Victor's broader plans in exchange for leniency. Ryan's expression hardened once more, duty reasserting itself over the personal moment they had just shared, though his hand found Grace's briefly, a silent promise that this conversation was far from finished, before he turned to address the growing crisis that still threatened everything he held dear. The information gathered from the captured attackers proved more valuable than anyone had anticipated, revealing not just Victor's immediate intentions but the full scope of alliances he had built among discontented factions scattered throughout the northern territories. Ryan spent the following days in constant motion, coordinating with loyal pack leaders, sending messengers to secure borders, and personally overseeing preparations for what everyone now understood would be a decisive confrontation rather than another isolated skirmish. Grace found herself drawn into these preparations in ways she had never expected, her knowledge of herbs and remedies proving essential as healers began stockpiling supplies in anticipation of potential conflict. She worked alongside palace physicians late into the night, preparing treatments for wounds both common and severe, grateful for the distraction that kept her mind from dwelling too long on the danger Ryan would soon be facing directly. Bran remained close to her during this period, his earlier injuries fully healed now, his strength returned in full measure. Grace often found herself resting a hand against his fur during quiet moments, drawing comfort from his steady presence, grateful beyond words that her instinctive choice weeks earlier in that forest clearing had led to this bond between them, one that felt as natural now as if they had known each other for years rather than a relatively short span of time. The confrontation with Victor's forces came on a cold morning nearly 3 weeks after the Garden attack, word arriving that his combined forces had crossed into contested territory near the northern border, clearly intent on testing Ryan's defenses directly rather than continuing with subtler tactics. Ryan gathered his own forces with the efficiency of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment, his expression calm and focused despite the enormous stakes involved. Grace insisted on accompanying the healers assigned to travel with the army, refusing to remain safely behind palace walls while others rode into danger on behalf of a kingdom that had, in these past months, become something she genuinely cared about protecting. Ryan argued against this decision initially, worried for her safety given recent events, but eventually relented when he recognized the same stubborn determination that had led her to save Bran's life in the first place, understanding that trying to prevent her from helping where she felt needed would be an argument he was unlikely to win. The confrontation itself unfolded over a tense day of positioning and negotiation before actual conflict became unavoidable, Ryan's forces meeting Victor's combined alliance across a wide valley that had seen border disputes for generations. Grace watched from a safe distance alongside the other healers, her heart in her throat as she witnessed Ryan address his gathered forces, his voice carrying clearly across the valley as he outlined the terms he was prepared to offer, terms that emphasized peaceful resolution over unnecessary conflict wherever possible. Victor, however, showed little interest in peaceful terms, his ambitions for territory and power apparently outweighing any consideration for the lives that would be lost in pursuing them through force. What followed was a carefully controlled engagement, Ryan's forces demonstrating both strength and restraint, working to neutralize threats and secure surrender wherever possible rather than pursuing unnecessary escalation. Bran fought alongside Ryan throughout, the bond between Wolf and King evident in their seamless coordination, each anticipating the other's movements with an understanding built over years of shared experience. By late afternoon, the confrontation had concluded with Victor's forces largely scattered or surrendered, the ambitious leader himself taken into custody after his remaining allies recognized the futility of continuing a fight they had already lost. Grace tended to the wounded on both sides throughout the following hours, her skills proving invaluable as healers worked to address injuries sustained during the engagement, grateful that Ryan's strategic approach had minimized casualties far more effectively than a less measured response might have achieved. It was well into evening by the time Ryan finally found her, exhausted but largely unharmed beyond minor scrapes, having spent the day ensuring both his own forces and the defeated remained properly cared for despite their opposition. He found her kneeling beside a young soldier, finishing the last of her treatments, and waited patiently until she had completed her work before approaching. "It's over," he said simply, relief evident in his voice despite the exhaustion etched across his features. Victor's alliance has been dismantled, and those willing to pledge peaceful cooperation have been offered the chance to do so. The northern border should remain secure for a long while now. Grace rose to meet him, taking in the various small injuries visible beneath his torn clothing, immediately reaching for her supplies to address them despite his protest that they were minor and could wait. "You need treatment too," she said firmly, guiding him toward a quieter area away from the bustling activity still surrounding the aftermath of the confrontation. "Sit down and let me help." Ryan complied, watching her work with an expression that held equal parts exhaustion and quiet affection. As she finished bandaging a cut along his forearm, he reached out to steal her hands, drawing her attention up to meet his gaze directly. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying a seriousness that made her pause entirely, "everything I said before the confrontation began, I meant every word. These past months have shown me exactly what kind of person you are, and exactly what kind of life I want to build going forward." Grace's breath caught at the intensity in his eyes, understanding that whatever he was about to say carried weight beyond simple gratitude or growing affection. "I have never been someone who makes decisions lightly," Ryan continued, "especially decisions concerning the future of my kingdom and my own personal life. But watching you these past months, seeing your courage in that forest clearing, your strength during the attack in the garden, your dedication to helping others regardless of the risk to yourself, I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of wanting you beside me, not simply as someone I care for, but as my equal, my partner, and if you'll have me, my Luna." The weight of the title settled over Grace slowly, understanding the significance of what he was truly offering, not simply affection but a permanent place at his side, ruling alongside him, bound to him in ways that went far beyond the temporary arrangement she had initially imagined when circumstances first brought her to the palace. She thought of her mother, of the small village clinic she had grown up helping to run, of the life she had once imagined for herself before a single act of instinctive kindness changed everything. "I never imagined my life taking this path," she admitted honestly. "When I cut my hair that night, I was only thinking about saving a creature in pain. I never thought it would lead me here, to this moment, standing before you." "Do you regret it?" Ryan asked quietly, genuine uncertainty evident beneath his usual composure. any of it. Grace shook her head slowly, a smile finally breaking through the exhaustion and tension of the day's events. Not for a single moment, she said. I would make the same choice again, without hesitation, even knowing everything that would follow. Then stay, Ryan said simply. Stand beside me not because circumstances brought you here, but because you choose to remain, for as long as you're willing to have me. Grace's answer came without hesitation, her heart having already made this decision long before her mind fully caught up to the reality of what she was agreeing to. Yes, she said softly, I choose this. I choose you, and Bran, and whatever future we build together. The weeks that followed brought changes neither of them could have fully anticipated: preparations for a formal ceremony recognizing Grace's new position, adjustments to palace life that came with her transition from outsider to Luna, and the slow process of building trust among nobles who had initially doubted her worthiness for such a role. Lady Vera, surprisingly, proved among the first to extend genuine acceptance once she witnessed firsthand the depth of Grace's dedication to the kingdom's well-being, her earlier skepticism giving way to reluctant admiration. Grace's mother arrived weeks later for the formal ceremony, tears of pride mixing with disbelief as she watched her daughter, once a simple village healer, stand before gathered nobles and pack leaders as they formally recognized her new position at Ryan's side. The hair that had been sacrificed so instinctively in that forest clearing had grown back over the intervening months, though Grace found she no longer thought of that choice as any kind of loss. Instead, throughout the kingdom, her story spread as a symbol of selfless courage, inspiring others to consider that true strength often revealed itself not through grand gestures planned in advance, but through instinctive kindness offered without hesitation or expectation of reward. Bran remained constantly at their side throughout the ceremony, the great wolf who had first drawn Grace into this unexpected life, now standing as living proof of what compassion, freely given, could ultimately create. As the ceremony concluded and celebrations began throughout the palace grounds, Ryan took Grace's hand, leading her toward the same gardens where danger had once threatened everything they now shared, though tonight the space held only peace, lanterns casting warm light across pathways where laughter and music replaced the tension of past conflicts. He turned to face her fully, gratitude and love evident in every line of his expression. From a wounded wolf in a forest clearing to this moment, he said softly, I never could have imagined where that single night would lead us. Neither could I, Grace admitted, smiling up at him, though I find myself endlessly grateful for every step that brought us here. Around them, the kingdom celebrated the joining of their king with a woman whose simple act of sacrifice had ultimately saved far more than a single wolf's life, weaving together a story that would be told for generations, of courage found not in grand ambition, but in the quiet strength to help without hesitation, regardless of the cost.